nothing. And in all wars, civilians have suffered, but there's a lot of research that's been done to show that in modern wars, it's primarily civilians who have suffered, and even civilians who are targeted as the objects of suffering. But as I was watching the B-52 bombers go over Baghdad, a sort of very funny idea occurred to me, I think out of the tragedy of the situation. And the idea was that instead of dropping bombs, mediators by the tens of thousands would parachute out with their little clipboards in their hands and pens and pencils, prepared to make dialogue happen. And it's silly and ridiculous, and it made me laugh, and it released me a little bit from some of the pain that I was feeling at the time. But I recognized that it was a fantasy, but I went on to ask a question, which turned it into something that became something else. And the question was, what would you do when you hit the ground? And is there something that you would actually do? And then why mediators? What does any of this have to do with us? Is there some possibility that, you know, we could take what we have learned in connection with community disputes, marital disputes, labor management disputes, all of these things that we've become familiar with and accomplished at, and turn them into some kind of transformation of the ways in which people, countries, cultures, religions interact with each other. And I absolutely, firmly, completely, totally believe that the answer is yes. So how did this yes come about in such an emphatic way? Well, over the last 28 years in which I have been mediating, I have done a fair amount of work in other countries. I have worked in, as TJ was saying a little earlier, excuse me if I can, oh, it's over here, isn't it? Let me just grab my cough medicine. You can believe that this is cough medicine if you want to. And so I've worked in over 20 countries, teaching conflict resolution, working with people who are in conflict, discovering what their issues were, and realizing that if Armenians and Azerbaijanis can figure out how to talk to each other about their problems in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the place where they were actually in battle with each other, why can't we figure out ways of talking to each other as well? And of course I have come to the realization that we are all just human beings. And as human beings, we get into conflict and we get out of conflict in very similar ways, regardless of our cultures. So it turns out that it is possible to create the kind of dialogue that TJ and Nan mentioned earlier, just as a matter of theory and as a matter of personal experience. But more seriously, the question becomes, what do you do when you hit the ground? What is it that mediators actually can do? I'd like to tell you a short story about Mediators Beyond Borders and about our first project as a way of illustrating this, and then we'll take it kind of from there. We formed the organization originally as Mediators Without Borders, but it turns out there's another organization that had the trademark for Mediators Without Borders before we did, so we changed our name to Mediators Beyond Borders. But in the very beginning, somehow a man in a refugee camp called the Budu Durham Refugee Camp in Ghana emailed somebody, and someone sent him my email. So he writes to me and he says, we're interested in somehow doing something in connection with conflict resolution. We've got all of these people in the refugee camp, and of course you know what it might be like in a refugee camp, even if you haven't ever been in one, which is people crowded together under difficult conditions, and that's a prescription for conflict. And there are multiple prescriptions for conflict in that circumstance. In addition to these, a large number of the people in the camp are child soldiers, and others are the people that they raped and tortured. So I get this message, and I said, I'd be happy to send you some literature. We didn't have anything else at the time. Can I send you something? So he says yes, and so I get my computer together and I send him off a training manual that I had drafted. He writes back and he says, thank you very much for the training manual. I can't afford the paper to print it. So of course I print out copies and send them off to him. And these copies end up being passed from person to person to person to person, kind of in a way that any writer would be desperate for people to treat their, the things that they've written in that way. The way that samizdat literature was passed around in the former Soviet Union. So I sent him these copies, and he began, sort of circulating them. And a mediator in the United States turned out was going to Ghana, knew about the refugee camp, so I put her in touch with him, and she agreed to do a training. She wasn't really a very well-known trainer. She wasn't anyone famous or well-known, hadn't written anything about the subject, but she went and she did a training. And now there are dozens of mediators in this refugee camp in Ghana, child soldier mediators in this camp. And then a couple of other people came forward and said, well, I would like to go. And then a delegation went. And then now people are going, and Eleni, where are you, Eleni? Here you are. Eleni is going in May to this refugee camp. Now, what you have to imagine here is how extraordinary a contribution it is to send a training manual to a group of people who are desperate for any resource whatsoever that they can use. And this is something that not just I can contribute, everyone in this room can contribute something to the people in this refugee camp. What do you get from contributing it? The answer is more than they get from your contribution. Because you get an open heart. You get a sense of dedication and purpose. You get the sense that you have actually helped somebody who was in need. You get to build your compassion and your capacity for empathy. You get to imagine yourself as a citizen of the planet. You get to tangibly contribute in a very small, person-by-person way to the correction of a fundamental problem with human society, and that is our tendency to kill each other, to rape each other, to treat each other badly. This is what we have to do. If I can put this now in a slightly different way, I've told this story, and you can begin to see, I think, what the meaning of this is. So let's take another step back and say, look at this from a slightly different angle, which is our angle. We in the United States, who are living a very wealthy existence compared to most people on the planet, certainly according to these people in the refugee camp. What is in it for us to do this type of work? Why should we be doing it? Martin Luther King actually said it very beautifully. He said, we are all a part of fabric of humanity. We are interwoven. And we may not be aware of it, but we are in fact interwoven with each other. So what's to make us aware of the fact that we are interwoven? The first thing, it seems to me, is that we can imagine the changes that are taking place on the planet, taking place as we speak, in a variety of different ways. But at least some of these changes are profound and dramatic and are going to have a huge impact on what happens to us. Some of these changes are exponential, meaning there's a difference between change which is incremental, that is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, and change which is 2 to the power of 4, 2 to the power of 10. That's exponential change. And what it looks like, if I were to draw a chart, I'd ask them to take down the screen here so you won't be able to see it. I was going to project it for you, but it just is a relatively flat line that goes along, starting, if you will,